Hello everyone. I think we'll get started. Thank you so much for joining. This is our cybersecurity panel. My name is Yun-Hee Kim. I'm a senior editor at the Wall Street Journal based in Hong Kong, and it's wonderful to see everyone. So in today's mobile age, hacking is one of the most serious threats and concern to all of us, both at work and at home. So we have an expert panel on cybersecurity. Some of the themes we'll be tackling today is looking at what are some of the biggest cyber attacks that could happen to all of us today? What is the impact on consumers, businesses, and countries? Then we'll look at some of the prevention measures. And finally, maybe we can look into the future. So how can we prevent future cyber attacks from happening? What is the role of artificial intelligence, big data, and machine learning in detection? So I will start by introducing our panelists. To my very right is David Koh, who is CEO of Singapore's Cybersecurity Agency. Next to him is Matthew Moynihan, who is CEO of ForcePoint. It's a security software firm based in Texas. To my left is Rafael Rosinski. He's the co-founder and principal of SecDev Group, based in Canada. And to my far right is Matthew Moynihan. It's Silvino Schlickman, who is director of cybercrime at Interpol. So welcome, everyone. I want to start off by looking at what is the biggest threat to us today. And David, you're in charge of Singapore's Cybersecurity Agency. You focus a lot on detection and prevention. So what worries you the most about potential attacks? What's keeping you up at night?
Okay. A lot. For those who are not aware, Singapore has a cybersecurity agency which I have the privilege to lead. This is a new agency. It's a central agency set up in the Prime Minister's office. And we're just over 2 years old. So the Singapore government decided that cyber is an important enough area and cross-cutting across the different parts of government that we needed a central agency. So we set up the Cybersecurity Agency of Singapore. Our primary remit are critical information infrastructures, CIIs. What are CIIs? These are the infrastructure that provide essential services to the government and to the nation as a whole. So those are the key areas which my agency focuses on. Give you an example of some of these critical information infrastructures. These will be the infrastructure that support telecommunications, electricity, land transportation, sea transportation, air transportation, medical services, security services. So these are the things that I think these are the things that I think keep me up at night. The worries, the concerns about the ability for us to provide essential services to the country as a whole, the economy, and the man in the street. Beyond this, that was my initial thinking when we first set up the Cybersecurity Agency. But beyond that, I've realized that actually keeping the lights on, keeping the telecoms services on is just the tip of the iceberg. That's what I would imagine that most citizens, most companies expect as basic provision of essential services in any country. So going beyond that, we've realized that we have to expand our remit and look into two other areas. One which we call the people sector, and then the other is the industries. There are many companies that aren't in this ambit of critical information infrastructure, but they're still providing essential services to the economy, to the people, etc. If all our retail malls were hit by some kind of event disruption and we couldn't, and all the shopping centers were closed, I would say that as a Singaporean, our life will be severely affected. Most Singaporeans wouldn't know what to do. Okay. So it may not be critical from an essential service perspective, but it's about the way of life. And second is that to the man in the street, everyone is connected now. Most of us right now on our cell phones, checking emails, etc. Most Singaporeans have more than one cell phone. So we want to be connected. We need to be connected all the time, and we have to continue to provide these kinds of services and make sure that they are well protected. So these are the things that keep me occupied.
Matthew, in terms of cyber attacks, what could be one of the worst cyber attacks going forward?
Yeah, I think one of the worst cyber attacks, and you talked about hacking, is really the hacking of people. We talk about IT systems. We were joking before the conference that we were in IT. This is my 20th year, and we were in IT security. We were in security before it was even called cyber. And the early viruses that were running around, which created the industry, weren't really even security threats. They weren't stealing people's data. They weren't. They were doing more cause to service levels and things of that nature with IT security. It's completely changed. And so the worst is really an insider threat type of attack, where you have someone who is trusted becomes untrusted. And that happens in several different ways. It could be a nation state, and all nation states are doing it, but nation state embedding an employee inside of a company who a company trusts and gives credentials to, who gives root access to core intellectual property, critical data that could have, governance or audit issues, if GDPR and other governance issues around critical data, intellectual property. You've seen with Google and Waymo, the self-driving car, going after Uber, Facebook and Oculus Rift and virtual reality. Those are the more high-profile ones. Insider threat isn't governed by true, regulations per se. Right? So a lot of these things are happening behind the scenes. So our focus really is around understanding behavior and intent. So humans can be hacked. In a world where there's no boundaries, in a world where enterprises are moving to the cloud and hybrid IT, all you really have is people at the end of the day interacting with systems. And once you've given them access, that's where the real challenge becomes. So keeping them out's one thing, but things have gotten so bad that that's almost like brushing your teeth. It's good hygiene. Right? You need antivirus. It's not going away, but it's not doing that much good to the real dangerous things. So at the end of the day, I think people are one of the more critical threats that exist right now.
And Rafael, do you agree? And what do you think is the biggest threat today?
Well, I certainly would echo what Matthew's saying about people, but I think I take a slightly different spin on it, and I'll return to it in a second. I think the biggest risk we have is that we've built the edifice of a global economic system on a technology which is ultimately a hack. The internet is a hack. It was developed for interoperability. It was developed for resilience of systems. It was never built for security. Anything we've applied on top of it, any cyber solution that we've decided to develop at a technical level, ultimately tries to patch something which at its fundamental DNA does not have the ability to be secured. Now that wouldn't be necessarily a big deal except for one other very important fact, and that's the demographic bomb. We have more people online now than we've ever had, and those numbers are going to go up. In Asia in particular, the growth has been absolutely staggering. In Myanmar, over the last 11 months, we've seen 10 million brand new Facebook users. We've seen countries like Bangladesh, the least developed country in this region, go from the lowest levels of connectivity to the highest level of connectivities. Why? Because of 4G, because of cheap smartphones, because effectively this technology is being propagated outward. Now this has had tremendously beneficial impacts. The empowerment of individuals to make decisions over their lives, whether that's economic, social, or political, is phenomenal. And that's a trend we're just starting to see right now. But what it also means is the internet has now started to reflect the rest of society, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The levels of criminality that we see right now aren't necessarily disproportionate to what we would see in any society. The challenge is that it is happening in an area where governance is weak, where national regulation really hasn't caught up in terms of physical and cyber, and where the opportunities, as the quote was once wrongfully attributed to John Derringer, is, why do I rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Why does cybercrime occur? Because that's where the money is.
Silvino, what do you think is the biggest threat today in terms of cyber attacks?
Well, I have to start thanking Rafael for highlighting the problem of the criminality. We see the cybercrime as a consequence of the society standards we have now. So we cannot differentiate what happens on the cyberspace from what is happening on the street level. So for example, we are used to think on how to deal with the traditional kinds of crime, and of course I will have to talk about crimes because I'm an Interpol agent. But the problem is how we blend the solutions we find for cybersecurity and bring it to cybercrime as well. One of the examples here is cybersecurity has a set of priorities, and cybercrime solving has another set of priorities. So we need to be engaged with the industry to make sure that along the way of patching a problem or interrupting an attack, we still keep some evidence behind so attribution can be achieved. This is one of the problems. The second one I see is the commoditization of the cyberspace. For criminals, we don't expect a drug dealer 20, 30 years in the market migrating to the cyberspace just because they want or just because they learn how to deal on dark web or with virtual currencies. They don't do that. What they do is that they hire somebody to do it. And although it was possible to be done many years ago, nowadays the platforms are so anonymous, they don't even know who they are hiring to do the job. And let's imagine they are paying somebody to run a website or a dark web website. They don't know who they are hiring, and the person hosting this website also don't know who they are dealing with. It changes completely the way you conduct investigations because you don't have such a strong syndicate as we used to have in the past when we could get just one piece of it and go after everybody. Nowadays it's much more challenging.
What is the biggest source of cyber attacks today? Is it a nation state or individual hackers? Rafael, want to take that?
Well, for the most part, it's individuals. I mean, we've created effectively a global cybercrime economy. And that has a number of different factors on it. First of all, look at the demographics. So over 50 or over 2/3 of those connected to the global internet right now are under the age of 35. More than 50% are under the age of 25. 3 out of 5 brand new internet users are coming from countries which are affected by fragility or considered to be failed. The motivation for challenging the status quo, for the redistribution of wealth, is tremendous. And given that, you know, we've effectively created there are a set of incentives for people to engage with that. The challenge, which my friend Silvio faces, I think, quite front line, is that we haven't really scaled policing to be able to deal with the issue of jurisdiction in cybercrime. There is no global cybercrime convention. We have the Budapest Convention, we have some regional arrangements, but the reality is that the ability to hide in jurisdiction to carry out crimes is fairly significant. How many of you have received an email message from an African prince asking you for details of your bank account? Okay? 6% in North America will respond to that message, leading to economic losses. That's led to a small but thriving economy in West Africa that has jurisdictional protection that allows these 409 scams to continue. Until we solve the problem of some kind of global definition around cybercrime and jurisdictional sharing, we are going to have this problem. And given the demographic bomb that I talked about before, this will persist. Organization will occur in that area. Yes, criminal gang specialization is happening, just like in any market. This is a market. This is a global market that exists in the absence of governance.
David, so in terms of regulation, in Asia, it's very difficult to detect cyber attacks because there are no specific disclosure rules. So it's harder to detect, harder to track, and harder to find a solution. Where does Singapore stand when it comes to the cybersecurity laws, and what can be done on the regulatory front to improve?
Firstly, let me pick up on what Rafael was saying. I fully agree. Cyber truly is a borderless domain. So, and criminal actors make full use of this difference in jurisdictions to their advantage. So precisely as what he's been saying, we on the one hand are governed by our archaic 20th century or even Westphalian constructs in terms of governance, rules, and legislation. But the criminals are making full use of this. So I think one of the key things that we see as essential is for governments to learn to work together and have cross-jurisdictional treaties, working arrangements to defeat the criminals who make deliberate use of jurisdiction gaps for their own work. In Singapore, we have just completed the public consultation for our first cybersecurity bill. So we are in the process of tabling to Parliament an omnibus cybersecurity bill, which will look after the cybersecurity domain within Singapore. The key aspects of it go back to what I was saying earlier, and that is that we are going to look into the provision of essential services, the critical information infrastructure operators. We're going to define what these CIIs are, and their responsibilities. The second is going to give CSA officers the right to investigate. Third, we're trying to facilitate information sharing among the entities involved, the CIIs, and sharing with CSA, and CSA sharing threat intel with them. We think this kind of legislation is essential to create an environment where the defenders have a fighting chance, because the attackers, the criminals, the state actors, the individuals, they are sharing information very effectively among themselves. It's we who are hampered by our laws, our jurisdictions, and our own privacy acts. The last bit of the legislation is that we are looking into regulating the cybersecurity industry. The cybersecurity industry is, on the one hand, not a young industry. On the other hand, it's growing very fast. I was telling somebody that in some respects, it's almost like the Wild West. There are a lot of snake oil salesmen around. And I think that there is a need for us to regulate some part of the market so that buyers can be protected and the information asymmetry can be leveled. The other aspect of Singapore government, which we're looking at, is we have a Personal Data Protection Commission, operates under the Personal Data Protection Act. And we are looking into strengthening the legislation to require companies to report and disclose when they have lost personal data. So these are some of the aspects, I think, which will facilitate information flow. I fully agree that lack of information sharing is a key aspect which is hampering our ability on the good side to deal with the big threat of cyber.
Just on the point of coordination and collaboration with other governments around the world, are you in talks with any governments to come up with a framework?
Yes. The CSA is just over 2 years old, but already in this short space of time, we've signed a memoranda of understanding with like-minded countries. We've signed with the US, with the UK, with France, with Australia, with India. We are in the process of signing negotiations with several other countries as well. And these are agreements which at the government-to-government level, which allow us to cooperate on best practices in cyber, CERT-to-CERT, computer emergency response team exchanges, threat intel exchanges, so that we can coordinate our actions. And the reason is very simple. An attacker may appear in the Far East today, and tomorrow will be attacking something in the US or in Europe. Vice versa, it can appear in Europe, just like we saw the WannaCry, Petya attacks, and then emerge in the Far East the day after. So there is an important need for us to share information.
In terms of recent attacks, Matthew, we saw the news last week about Equifax Credit Bureau in the US, massive data breach, 140 million consumers were affected. What went wrong there, and could that have been prevented?
No, it's a good question. We've seen this before. It wasn't the largest breach, potentially the most dangerous, given the information that was stolen. It was one of the first times that driver licenses and this
Social security numbers, birth dates.
The 4 worst pieces of data you would want anyone to ever get were stolen. It's the same old story, right? And so I would almost say that while the internet is a hack, right, it really is about trust and anonymity and what people are doing. So I think the cyber industry is caught in something where it really needs to have a paradigm shift. It's almost like the old days of the availability market in IT, right? When e-commerce first came about, everyone wanted to stay up 100% of the time. We cannot go down. Our business is availability. If our site goes down, we lose money. And then sites started going down, right? And then if someone like an Amazon used to spend something like 96 cents out of every dollar on staying up, and then they switched it to reverse to recovering from failure, right? The industry has got to realize people are going to get in, right? How do you stop the bad things from getting out, right? In a world where everybody's moving to the cloud or these types of threats continue to get through, it's like the things that happened to Equifax probably could have happened to any company out there. Right? And so I think the question is, once they get in, how do you stop the exfiltration from happening? I also think we need to separate out, as we talk about cyber, We've talked about a lot of different types of things. We've talked about theft. What is the difference between a hack, an attack, and petty crime? Cyber is not a separate domain in my mind. If you look at the terrorist attacks that have happened since 9/11 in the US, and I think the stats hold true for the world in large, over 90% of all the terrorist attacks that have taken place since 9/11 have happened by nationals in the country. What is that? I mean, so it's borderless. A lot of the physical attacks that happen are planned in cyber. A lot of the cyber attacks are planned in physical. And so we live in a world where the continuum from petty crime to disruption is playing out in the internet, just like it has in physical security. And so, I do think we need to focus on the difference between a hack and an attack. And we're not going to be able to solve everything in cyber, just like you don't solve it in the physical world that we live in. There was a gentleman the other day that was caught in the U.S. Hacking into a database inside of the company to steal a small set of credit card information to go buy a coat for his child. Right? He knew where the black market was, and it was $100 US or whatever it was. What's the difference between that and walking into the mall and buying and stealing a coat for your kid? I mean, does that rise to the level of a hack or an attack, or is that just the way human society works? So, I think we need to really think about how do we get some level of focus and what are we trying to prevent, because the prevention for that is very different than trying to prevent cybercrime, which we'll probably never be able to stop, in my opinion.
Rafael?
Just to follow up on something that Matthew said, if you look at the, let's say, 5 last really egregious breaches that have occurred in corporate America, whether it's WannaCry, whether it's Equifax, whether it's Sony, whether it's Target, every single one of those was preventable. At the end of the day, the fault lay with the companies themselves not taking very simple, very well-known measures in order to either patch or put in process to prevent those kinds of breaches from happening. There's a cultural problem in terms of cybersecurity, in terms of how it's being handled by the C-suite level globally. As long as cybersecurity was looked at as a means of liability management, something that we'll deal with compliance, these kinds of things will happen all the time. Until we're looking at it proactively as part of a threat risk assessment process, which is constantly running, when it sits with the CFO's office, not the CISO's office, we're going to continue to see these kinds of problems. The other issue is, and this is not a secret, the cybersecurity industry is in the dark ages. The fact that we're talking cybersecurity, rather than recognizing that we're actually dealing with several distinct now categories within the Internet of social or people, the Internet of things, and the Internet of value, all of which require different kinds of approaches and solutions. We're still going to be dealing with silicone snake oil, trying to deal with chronic problems. I'll give you 3 statistics which are important to know, and then just gives you, or goes at the level of the lack of sophistication in the cybersecurity industry. Over 92% of all malware uses a single control plane, something called the domain name system. Yet less than 30% of corporate America, this is the Fortune 1000, have any perspective within their networks over DNS. Say that to yourself. 92% of malware uses DNS. Less than 30% of the Fortune 1000 have perspective on DNS. Okay? 88% of US industries plan to deploy IoT. Yet 90% of executives within that industry have no confidence that the cybersecurity solutions they have in place give them proper compliance over IoT devices. 90%, last one, and this goes to something that Matthew said, 90% of all breaches use a human vector. Try to engineer security around human nature. Really difficult.
You brought up IoT. A lot of our devices are connected now. I think I saw a data point that about 40 trillion devices by 2021 will be connected. IoT makes it more vulnerable for cyber attacks, correct? So how do we prevent more attacks in the IoT era?
If I may just jump in here, I think that there are 2 aspects of IoT. One is IoT having a phenomenally much larger number of devices, which then facilitate attacks. Those would then manifest themselves in the traditional IT space that we are familiar with. But I think the bigger challenge is IoT devices being hacked and then cyber manifesting itself in the real world. IoT devices control trains, they control traffic lights, they control aircraft movements. All right? If you get a hack on an IoT device, it's not loss of data that we're talking about. It's not credentials that you lose. It's not crime that's facilitated, but actually real lives can be impacted, including loss of life. IoT devices are in hospitals. Most of them are not secured because the primary focus of the developers on the IoT devices is A, to get it to work. There are real technical challenges to get it to work. So the first thing they're trying to do is to get it to work. And then B, make sure that the price point is where the consumer wants it to be. So most IoT devices are actually pitched at entry level in terms of cost. All right? And there's no follow-on backup service. You are not going to sign a $100 a year contract for updates on your refrigerator for IoT management. Okay, you're not going to have a firewall or antivirus installed on your refrigerator or your home entertainment system. But these are points of real concern. And if they hack it, well, they can do nefarious things to your refrigerator and to your home entertainment system. Well, on the one hand, you don't think that's significant. But when you extend this argument to industry, power plants, telecommunication systems, traffic light, traffic management, air traffic control, medical services, then I think that you can connect the dots. That's a real threat.
Silvino, I want to ask you, what do you think is the best prevention measure in the IoT era? We touched upon the risks and how serious it could be, but how do you prevent yourself from, if you have an IoT device, refrigerator, coffee maker, gets hacked, gets all this data, what do you do?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I always make it to me many times. When you are about to purchase some of this equipment, the first thing I will ask, do I really need that thing? You have everything connected if you need nowadays. Do you need to connect your coach to the internet or not? Probably not. So many times you are taking these decisions based on an impulse, but the same thing can be said about the industry, as David said. We are in contact with many layers of the industry nowadays, and the very basic and hard truth is that they need to put it in the market. The price needs to be right. They need to do it before the competitors, and security issues are left behind. Sometimes they are never addressed. And we can use this perspective also to understand the growth of the footprint of the internet and the connected device. We had the very, very serious example of the Mirai botnet last year, where IoT devices were used to launch attacks over the rest of the infrastructure. So you are not only exposing yourself, but we are also empowering criminals when you install a unprotected device at your home. So can you imagine people going around and patching these equipments every now and then? Of course not. You will not stop your life to patch your coach or your refrigerator to put new security features on it. And the same can be said about the industry. On the WannaCry, one of the interesting examples we saw is that it affected parking meters. Are you considering to run a parking business and once in a while go there, connect a keyboard in your parking meter and see if the Windows is on the right version and then update it? That's not economically viable. So I'm not running against the wave and asking people to disconnect ourselves, but one thing has to be said. We need to be cautious about that, and we need to see the consequences of it. What we see in the crime area that is a big, big problem is with the health sector, as David mentioned. We have in hospitals, for example, some of those equipments are multi-million-dollar equipment, and they come with a PC, and this PC has to run a specific version of operational system. We cannot do anything about it. It's not that if you update it, it will lose warranty or something. It just stopped working. So you need to keep it there, and it might be a 95 or 2000 version of the operational system. You cannot protect it. So what do you do then? You can put safeguards around it, you can segregate from the network, we can put a lot of infrastructure on it, but that's not usually what the director of a hospital is concerned about. So there is a need for a bit more of maturity on what kind of things need to be connected, what kind of protocols you need to follow, and then comes back to the point raised by Rafael here, is there's little or none regulation on this sector. We don't know exactly how far we can go and what kind of security points you need to check. I know it is still compliance, but not even that is put on the table for us to consider. So that's probably the biggest threat for us.
David, what about regulation? Because Silvino talked about regulation in the IoT era.
So, regulation is it's a fraught word. When we came out with our cybersecurity bill in Singapore, as I said, the primary focus of it was to look at how we can have better oversight over the companies and the industries that provide essential services to the running of the country. Even when we did this, the knee-jerk reaction from the people we consulted was, no, we can't have regulation. It's a new industry, and if you do this, then you'll stifle the industry, you'll stifle innovation. Singapore will be locked out from the best products of the world. So we have spent the last couple of months actually dealing with the different stakeholders, explaining to them what exactly we're trying to do. And by and large, it's a very light touch regulation. We need to put in place some of the basic regulations because the reality is that the whole cyberspace is moving so rapidly that industry themselves are not able to keep up. Buyers are not able to keep up. And we think that there is, for want of a better term, a market failure. It's not something which the market has so far been able to address by itself. So we talk about the example of IoT devices. Well, the ideal case is that if you expect markets to work perfectly, that consumers will recognize that, it's in our interest to buy a better product which has on it cybersecurity features, etc. And the market will then move in that direction and provide these products. Unfortunately, that's not what we're seeing. And part of the reason is because if you look at the environment, the bad things that happen when you have an unpatched IoT device, the bad things that happen when IoT devices are made use of, don't occur to the individual. They occur to somebody else. So here you are, you're buying something. If something bad happens and it impacts you, then you have an incentive, a natural incentive to buy a better product. But what's happening is that people are taking over unprotected IoT devices and they're using it to launch attacks on other people, on other systems. So to the individual who paid for that system, nothing has happened to him. Okay? But the net impact is that it impacts the rest of society. So you can see that there's a natural break in terms of the incentive structure. So it has resulted in my view, market failure. So in a case like this, there is a need for governments to come in, try to put in place legislation. It has to be light touch because the industry is moving, society is moving, and then try to move it in a certain direction. Governments can't do it by themselves. We have to work. It's a multi-stakeholder issue. We have to work with the people sector. We have to work with industry. We have to work with academia. And we're totally cognizant of this. But there is a need for us to move because if we just allow the industry to self-regulate, we will allow markets to eventually reach a landing point. It may not happen because I think that there are certain the incentive structures appear to me to be not aligned.
Matthew.
Yeah, I agree in general. I just think it's very, very difficult to do this because the cyber market moves so quickly, the hacking community moves so quickly that whatever regulation you put in, I agree, you don't want to go too heavy, but the lighter you go, it just becomes a low water mark, right? Even like PCI compliance. All the companies that are getting hacked now are PCI compliant, right? And that is expensive in many cases to go through. Nothing like SOX, but I think it's really catch-22. I hate to say it, but I think it's around moving away from what the internet was fundamentally founded on, which is trust. And you see the most sophisticated companies today implementing zero trust models, right? They're air gapping things, right? They're not letting people get access. And the more sophisticated technologies today are now air gapping behavior, right? But when you look at it, the analog in the consumer world is to defriend people on Facebook. I don't want their fake news. I don't want them as a friend. I don't know who that was. How many people had 1,000 friends? Now you're getting back down. Now people are leaving Facebook because of Their parents. Parents aren't their friends. I want to get off this platform. I don't trust my parents, you know. But so I think it is around, unfortunately, moving away from this hackable network, which is the internet, which was founded on trust, which is the most beautiful virtue you can have, and getting back to a situation whereas and defining your own zone of comfort, right? Whether it be your home entertainment system, whether it be your business or what have you, because at the end of the day, the big difference between the internet and the physical world. In the physical world, there's mitigations that go along with the breadth of impact of something happening. You know, the mafia. Let's take the mafia, right? I mean, there's local mafia. It's very hard to build out those networks. You know, it's easy to build a regional one. Very hard to build a global one. The internet's easy. You know, one person can be their own complete network because of the impact and the one-to-many relationship of the internet. So, I think maybe consumers have to adopt what some of the enterprises are doing, which is moving toward a zero trust level.
Can I just jump onto that point? I think that there are, to build on that point of the difference between the physical world and the cyber world, I think all of us are at fault. If you think about it, all of us have natural instincts which will come to physical security. Before we leave our house, you left your hotel room, you lock the door. You know, you carry your keys with you. You know, you don't leave your wallet lying around. You don't flash your money around, and then you're a bit more careful, perhaps not in Singapore when you walk around at night. And all of these instincts have been ingrained in us, trained. And if you think about it, they were trained by our parents when we were kids. Our parents taught us what to do, what not to do. We have none of that on the internet. Part of the reason is because the internet's fairly new, but also because my parents weren't internet savvy. They didn't teach me anything. So all of us have been thrust into this without having those instincts ingrained in us, trained in us, and built up over time. So we enter the internet without these natural instincts, without knowing what needs to be done, what you can do, what you can't do, what you should do, what you shouldn't do. And we're just there, and today, the kids are getting onto the internet at the age of 3, 4, 5, you know, and they enter with a trusting attitude. But the reality is that when you connect to the internet, you're not connecting to a trusted place. Okay, you're not connecting to the schoolyard. You're not connecting for a Singaporean. You're not connecting to Singapore. You know, the instincts which you have living in a physical world in Singapore may not be relevant when you connect to the internet, because when you connect to the internet, you're connecting to the whole World Wide Web. You know, with all the good, the bad, and the ugly that exists there. So there is, in my view, a need for us to push up ratchet up public education so that we can train our people starting from very young, from grade school, nursery school, to know what to do on the internet. Otherwise, we're just like they're lambs being led to the slaughter.
Rafael, what about the cloud? How much of a threat is the cloud? We store a lot of our data now into the cloud. Google Docs. How safe is that?
Well, at a technical level, I think it's about as secure as the rest of the internet, so I don't think there's much to be said about that. Where the cloud becomes, I think, important is in terms of data sovereignty. Where does it reside and what kind of rights and rules are connected to that, which I think goes to the larger question of the fact that we currently don't really have a global regime of governance over both data as well as cyberspace in a way that's truly functional. We've had a number of ad hoc agreements which have, I think, propelled the fact that cyberspace has become a friction-free environment for global trade and for overlay companies like Google, Facebook to actually be able to exist. But whether that is something that's going to continue into the future, I think is a really big question. I think one of the big risks that we face as a result of the complexity of what cyberspace represents as a negotiation of the social contract between individuals and public institutions, which every country is going through, is we are going to go through an era of a lot of regulatory experimentation, which is going to cut up the internet, which is going to change its business model, which is going to create differentiations in jurisdiction, which for the business community is going to have a heck of a lot more impact than any malware breach that we've been talking about for the last 40 minutes. The danger of over-regulation, poor regulation, segmentation, I think is one which will impact on the global economy far, far more. And let's not forget, I think it was Al Gore that said it this morning, but if not, it's a statistic that's well known, about 26% of the global economy over the next 3 years is going to be the digital economy. that percentage is going to continue to rise. The reality is that prosperity trade depends on this infrastructure, and yet we don't even have the governance right quite yet. That's something which is very fundamental that needs to be addressed.
China has tightened its cybersecurity law, which requires a lot of the companies, foreign companies operating in the country, to store data locally. How much of a risk is that to companies like Apple? Apple has decided to locally have their servers in China. What are the implications?
Well, China is its own world. I think it's a large enough economy and ecosystem that companies like Apple can take the risk to conform to national regulation. The problem is that if every country starts adopting exactly the same kind of laws, that is an existential threat to companies like Apple, like Google, like Facebook, that actually rely on having aggregate data that isn't domiciled on a national level. If you ask yourself why they are currently spending a disproportionate amount of money on lobbying, at the local level, it's exactly because of that. But it's not a problem that is going to be solved overnight.
David, your thoughts about data storage locally?
Yes, I fully agree with what Raphael said, but I want to share a different perspective. I was speaking to a senior official from a very small country, and he said that his country was still larger than Singapore, and he said that his country had a government policy, and that policy was that all their data that had been stored in their backup servers had to be held outside their country because they were concerned about a real-world, physical, existential threat that one of their neighbors was large enough to march physically into their country. And then if all your servers, all your data was domiciled in their country, then theoretically you could lose the entire country. So that's a reverse view, a totally different perspective from the China example. But there are, it just shows that the environment is different, and the driving factors are different depending on the situation that you have. But I fully agree that there is a need for us to have a better view on how to deal with cyber. In some respects, some people see cyber as another domain as in air, land, and sea. So in terms of land, we have international laws, rules in terms of how we manage borders, cross-border flows, etc. In the sea, the United Nations had a long discussion over 2 decades on the which ultimately coalesced around the United Nations Convention for the Law of the Sea, and that allows for freedom of navigation, the rights of states, littoral states, etc. And that allows for free flow of trade. And Singapore is a big beneficiary of this. If you think about it, Singapore is an island, but we are locked by not the EEZs, but the territorial waters of other countries. If we didn't have freedom of navigation, ships wouldn't be able to come into Singapore without asking permission from neighbors whose territorial waters they are transiting through. But because of the United Nations Convention for the Law of the Sea, we have free trade. The same needs to be done for the internet. There has to be some kind of convention on how we move information, how we move trade. Already 26% of global trade is on the internet. This is not regulated today. There are no conventions for this. There are conversations that have already started. United Nations has a process involving the group of governmental experts on ICT, which are looking into this this is a group of experts from different countries who are hopefully going to work out something, and then this will ultimately, hopefully, be discussed at the United Nations General Assembly, and then it can potentially take the view of something like the United Nations Convention for the Law of the Sea. I think that will be a general direction that we're hoping. It can't be something that's done only by governments. Cyber is unique, I think, that big companies, internet service providers, telcos, the big internet firms, they have the wherewithal, they have information, they have the capacity, and it's a multi-stakeholder issue, and many people need to be involved in this discussion.
I wanted to shift the discussion to look at some of the technologies that could be used in the future to better detect from cyber attacks. Artificial intelligence is emerging as one of those technologies. Matthew, how much of help could AI, big data, machine learning be in terms of detecting the next big threat?
Yeah, so I think it can be helpful. I mean, people throw around these buzzwords, quite frequently today.
Is it just a buzzword?
Well, actually, machine learning is a subset of AI. And they talk about it and just throw it around. So I think it'd be incredibly helpful. I mean, obviously, it's incredibly helpful in disciplines where you have big data, and then you have sort of, can we teach machines to replace humans? And there's a continuum of technologies that go up to that, right? And I think we're in the first stage of that. And so I think machine learning is the one that's probably the most applicable today, which essentially, without getting too much into it, there's two different types. There's supervised and unsupervised. The supervised is when you have two different data sets and you can teach a machine to understand the differences between them really quickly. Super helpful. I mean, super helpful, right? I mean, that just basically replaces the pure horsepower of human beings with, some trained intelligence, right? Then there's unsupervised, which is, the stuff of science fictions, right? Machines thinking on their own. And so I think we're in the very early days on that. So I think getting through big data sets, enhancing big data sets are incredibly helpful, looking for trends and things. I personally think that it's not going to be as helpful for cyber. And the problem with a lot of these technologies are they're not done in real time. They're still very much batch. And if you look at one of the most interesting developments in cyber attacks over the past 10 years, when the term advanced persistent threat came into it, was patience, right? When you're patient, you can avoid data sets. You sit there and you wait 6 months, you wait another 3 months, and so ultimately humans are, it's going to come down to a chess game, Big Blue versus Kasparov, who wins that? It's still a pretty good battle, right? So I think it'll be important on the easy side of things. It'll be more difficult to make real-time decisions in security, which is troubling, because if you look at what's happening with the Internet of Things, which is a broad range of devices, everything from sneakers with sensors in them to cars. If someone were to take over a car, or someone were to impersonate someone who owned that car, and you had to make a real-time decision driving, would you trust a machine to do that? So I think the implications of whether machine learning or AI can help cyber will really depend on the application of some of these devices and new technologies out there.
Silvino, does Interpol utilize AI in terms of detection?
Yeah, that's a question of, I think we can split it in two parts. First, for the criminals, it's definitely a good platform. It's a good technology to use. For example, there are many services called counter-antivirus services. Maybe not everybody is aware of it. There are platforms where hackers can submit their viruses and see if any of the current antivirus would recognize it as a virus. These kind of platforms are widespread. Many of them are running currently, and they can make a very good use of AI on how to advise those hackers what to put there, what to take out of this piece of malware to make it unrecognizable. So this is one very quick win that the criminals could use, and we have the impression that they are using it already without being able to prove it yet, but it seems to be occurring nowadays. This is one thing. The other thing with AI is that it also helps on the APT model, the Advanced Persistent Threat. It is considered to be an expensive business model for the criminals because they need to invest resources and many times a lot of time. It requires patience, as Matthew mentioned. That's why probably we see the criminal market moving to a more randomized kind of thing. So they will attack everybody. They will attack every single node they can to get data or to get hold of infrastructure. That is something that we can clearly see happening. So it is not necessarily a targeted person. So you cannot hide anymore between your own level of relevance. You cannot pretend I'm not important enough to be attacked. You will be attacked. As long as you are connected, you are a potential victim. Moving it from the APT to this model, it's because it's easier to automatize. If you include some AI on it, you can use these randomized methods to go back in time and keep on doing APTs, because you can learn from one example to another, and you can keep machines doing those attacks, but with some intelligence level comparable to a APT. Of course, it will not be the same thing as a human interaction, but you can do it 1,000 times in parallel. You can attack 100 million computers at the same time. So the efficiency will be reduced, but your results might be increased because you are doing it in parallel.
Yeah, I'd agree with a lot of that Matthew had to say, and maybe put it in slightly less diplomatic terms. I do think there's a bubble around AI hype at the moment. Most of the advances that we've seen in AI in the last decade are a result of Moore's law, better processors, bigger ability to deal with data sets, not necessarily development of symbolic reasoning. There's a structural factor that limits the way that we can use supervised machine learning on the internet beyond the way of sort of automating repetitive tasks, and that is that it's a synthetic environment. It is constantly evolving, both as a technology and in interaction with human beings, which means that you can be perfect in detecting something recursively, in other words, going backwards based upon your training set, but be completely wrong going outwards. So there's a term of art which is not very well known outside of the cybersecurity community, but that's small data analysis. In other words, leveraging the fact that the internet is ultimately a control plane that has very specific control points, and being able to focus on those correlates as a way of being able to identify malfeasant behavior or technical patterns that are indicative of breaches. That has a lot of future to it, but that's very different than the kind of big words of AI, machine learning that we throw around in the industry.
Just one point on that. I mean, I tend to think sometimes of security very simplistically. Most of security issues are a function of impersonation, right? Check writing fraud, getting on the phone and tricking someone into something, getting someone to click on something they shouldn't. Machines can't help with that, right? They can't help with that.
Yeah.
So if I can just jump in, I totally agree. I think if you look at the incidents of cyber attacks, cybercrime, most of the attacks are not sophisticated. They're not technically sophisticated. So the solution is not more technology. It's not a better mousetrap. The fact of the matter is that most of them are occurring because of human nature. Why do people respond to Nigerian princes? All right, it's got nothing to do with the technology. The only reason that it's making news, I think, is because the reach of the scam artists is now global. In the past, you used to have these scam artists, but they had to do it on a one-to-one basis. Their immediate reach was limited, but now because of the internet, their reach is been multiplied. They can send 1 million emails, literally, and all they need is a batting average of 1%, 0.5%, 0.1%. It's worth their while.
I think we have time for audience questions. Does anyone have a question? Sir, could you identify yourself?
Talk a lot about perimeter security by and large, air gapping, firewalls, securing IoT devices. But to David's point, at the end of the day, the people harmed aren't the individuals, it's the companies. And yet the companies don't seem to be doing a whole lot in actually protecting the data and putting in technologies internally that even if there was a breach, there's not, you can't get at useful data. Equifax, how was the data encrypted? And then a further question is, at what point do we wake up, and maybe this is a regulatory question, and say, well, things like social security numbers and driver's licenses that are plain text somewhere is just not a viable thing. I think, what the metric is, something that 20 people knows is no longer a secret. Well, I'm sure all of us have given out social security numbers in the US to more than 20 people, right? But yet there seems to be all the stock and money go into defense at the perimeter. But who's responsible for actually changing the game on the inside? The person who accidentally clicks on that phishing attack within the organization that exposes the firm to the breach. What's their responsibility?
Well, I think you put your finger on something really important, which I mentioned earlier. I think ultimately, the maturity of understanding cybersecurity as being critical to the enterprise has not yet arrived at the C-suite level. It's very much still seen as a compliance exercise for the most part. And let's face it, the cybersecurity industry was built by who? Engineers. What's the single most valuable vector of attack? Human beings. There's a bit of a disjuncture there, and one that needs to be addressed. I think David put his finger on it. There are at least 3 things that are effective at a policy level in dealing with cybersecurity, whether you're talking about the nation state or the enterprise. One is digital literacy. Make sure that we treat how we effectively educate individuals coming into this world to operate in the cyber world with the same diligence that we do for the physical world. Digital citizenship, understanding what norms and behaviors are acceptable. You know, we didn't talk at all about what Russia's hacking of Facebook by using algorithmic marketing had on the US elections, or how the normalization of extremism is starting to become a real issue in this region just simply because that's the efficaciousness of politics. But that's part of digital citizenship, which is a step up from digital literacy. And lastly, upstream security. You know, ultimately the internet is a control plane, which means addressing security at the core of the network rather than at the endpoints goes a long way to solving a lot of the problems that we see happening. And that's a systemic problem. I meant to say that when we were talking about IoT. You know, 90%, and this is a figure I'm pulling out, you know, of investment right now, if you're looking at where research labs are at, are on endpoint security. Very little investment goes into core network security. Why? It's not sexy. It's a difficult graduate student problem to deal with. It's a lot more complex than building a device. But ultimately, you know, things such as, for example, control over DNS go a long way to dealing with a malware problem without having to worry about how it affects endpoint devices. Most directly, your answer, though, is C-suite level has to understand cyber from the point of view of continuity of business, threat risk analysis, not just compliance. That's where it starts.
What would it take for the C-suite to recognize that?
A couple of more Equifaxes, Sonys, and others touching them, unfortunately.
Any other questions? Oh,
Yeah,
I know you had something.
just to add a bit on that, we have definitely digital literacy is a big problem, but it is still a cultural problem. We see this example happening many times, and even among the law enforcement community. You expect law enforcement guys to be a bit more aware of these kind of things, but that's not necessarily true. There is this belief coming out of I don't know where, that just because it works, because it is shiny, and I pay a lot for it, it's safe. So there is this problem that you just rely on technology. This is something that needs to be changed, and it's something that it's not a fast movement. It will take a while. The other aspect of it is, what exactly is a suspicious email that you should not click on? The first time I used the MRT here in Singapore, I was amazed by the sound that say that if you see a suspicious-looking person or article, please report. What is a suspicious person in a MRT in Singapore? Probably myself. I look around. I was by far the most distinct person on that train. So that's something very subjective, and online is even harder to tell apart. I will never be able to explain to my mother what kind of links she can click or she cannot click. It will never work. So the problem raised by Rafał is quite interesting. It's how you protect the core of it. And it has a huge impact on your procedures and your methodologies. So every time you make a compromise between security and convenience, every time you allow somebody to take access to something straight away without going to a new authentication process or going through another air gap, it's more convenient, but you are giving up on something. So it is a matter of not endpoint, it's a matter of procedure as well. You will always get attacks. People will always be lured by one or other of these attacks. There must be something else in place.
If I can just build on those points, from my perspective, there's no such thing as absolute security. The only computer that is secure is the one that's still in the box. So once you take it out, once you connect it, once you want to use it, you're taking on risk. So when you look at it from a nation state perspective, from an enterprise perspective, from an individual perspective, it's always a three-way balance. You're trying to balance usability, security, and cost, right? You can't get it, you can't get all three of them all the time. You have to make judgment decisions. So the key question is, going back to what Rafał said, is that who is making these decisions? In many enterprises, what we see is that it's a backroom issue. It's the IT department who's making the decisions. There are trade-offs that need to be made. The big question is who is making these trade-offs. If it's the IT department, it's the wrong answer. Because the consequences of a hack, the consequences of someone getting into your system, consequences are for your business. It's a boardroom issue. It's a C-suite issue. So the people who have to deal with the consequences should be the ones who are making those balanced trade-off decisions. In many companies we see, in many parts, agencies in government, it's not the CEO, it's not the C-suite who are making these trade-off decisions. In order to make those trade-off decisions, then you need to be adequately informed. All right? So if you look at a typical CEO or typical C-suite, when it comes to their knowledge of the industry that they're in, it's right up there. When it comes to finance issues, it's right up there. But when it comes to cyber issues, it's down here. So there's this valley, right, of information and knowledge that exists in most C-suites, even in government. And if that's the state of the understanding, then they're not equipped to make these trade-off decisions, but they need to.
Just very quickly, because we're running out of time, if you were to give our audience your top 3 tips on prevention, what would they be to all of our panelists?
I think it's prioritization. You know, what information is important to you about you, and you can take steps. I mean, you can freeze your credit line, and there's things you literally can do, and people have done that, and that solves the problem, right? So imposing a little bit of inconvenience on you would probably get you 10 pounds of prevention more than anything else. I do think, you know, in a sad way, I think it is thinking about trust. You know, whether it's social platforms, because of the nature of the internet, there's always going to be someone out there that can reach you and take advantage of you. And that's not saying someone you know. I'm not saying, you know, get negative on the world or anything like that. But you can't assume you're safe, you know, and that's an unfortunate thing with cyber. And then, you know, I do think, you know, working for companies that take the right precautions, you know, I think you're going to start seeing cyber, quality of cyber programs, quality of cyber culture, start to come into play in decision making. You know, you're working at a company where you feel fundamentally safe. It could be physical security, it could be digital security, it could be both. And I do think you're going to start seeing physical and digital security converge over time.
Right. Before I answer that question, I just want to make a plug to say that, you know, like the panel has been talking about doom and gloom. I think the whole
Yes, very scary world out there.
But I want to make a plug to say that cybersecurity is actually an enabler. It's an enabler. It's not a drag. It's not a drag on innovation. It's not a drag on ICT, future technologies, and all the great promises that Smart Nation or ICT technologies promises us. I see cybersecurity as an enabler. Let me explain it in the form of an analogy.
We're running out of time, so
Right.
very quickly.
Let me explain it as an analogy. You know, it's like brakes on a car. If you want to go fast, you need good brakes. The faster you want to go, the better the brakes. So cybersecurity are the brakes on the car. All right. So that's how I would see it. All right. So we need to get cybersecurity right so that we can move faster in the digital world.
Your top tip, Rafael?
Yeah, this is a question I often get, and I sort of did a review a little while ago to see how my answer to this question changed over the last 10 years, and it hasn't. I've always said the same 8 things. It's just that every time I have to dress it up. Today I'm going to juggle while I'm saying the same 10 things. Anyway, I think the serious matter of this, if you are in a company, if you run a company, stop thinking cybersecurity, start thinking cyber risk. Cyber risks allows you to think about this in a different way, addressing issues of trust, addressing issues of technology, addressing issues of regulatory impact that goes beyond simply whether I'm going to buy another box from vendor X. That's super critical, super important. If you're a shareholder and a company doesn't have a cyber risk strategy, demand one. If you're a CEO, start implementing one.
Well, usually we talk with the society, and I would extrapolate what we recommend for a person to a company. The first advice we give is, if you don't understand how it works, don't use it. It's the very simple advice. Well, I bought this online hard drive. I don't know what I did, but now I can access my photos for my cell phone. That's not a good sign. If you don't understand what is happening behind it, probably you are not secure enough. That's number one. Number two, and how it connects back to a company is many times we are presented with shiny strategies and shining products and how it will be amazing for your business. Give a step back, take a bit more of time and try to understand what is happening behind that. It is the key aspect for us. I agree that is an enabler. For Interpol, for example, it would be impossible to conduct our business if we couldn't rely on cybersecurity. But we need to understand that. And an organization like ours spend a sizable amount of our resources just to take care of cybersecurity. And that's a thing that you need to do in your companies as well.
On that note, please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you very much.